All right, we're doing this. First thing I got to tell you, more than anything else, possibly more important than anything else that's going to be said today, is that if you are engaged in attempting to live action roleplay and you are living in North America right now, you're a fucking idiot. There's no other way to put it. There is no way currently to safely engage in live action roleplaying the way that we know it. Even if you maintain social distancing, even if you are wearing masks the entire time, gathering a whole lot of people together in order to play through a role-playing game in one location is asking for trouble by increasing the number of people who are playing. I understand that there are some locations where it might even be possible to do this. New Zealand has done a wonderful job of controlling its outbreak. There are European countries as well. But if you're in North America and you are arranging for a gathering of people, you are, at the moment, putting other people's lives at risk. Most likely not yours. The reason why I put it this way is because a lot of the people who live action roleplay are still relatively young and relatively healthy. And you're not the ones I'm worried about. People who I'm worried about are the ones who you're going to interact with later. The ones who you will carry a virus that will be relatively inconvenient for you and potentially deadly for everybody else. Just don't do it. Don't try. And don't believe anybody when they say that they're putting forward the safety precautions that they think will ensure that everyone is going to stay okay. Because it won't. Mass gatherings are the ways that we spread things. And unfortunately, we also can tell that when people are live action role playing, there's enough people who are fuck ups without an outbreak period that you're going to see them that they will be violating the rules that are required, such as social distancing or not wearing masks or self-reporting your own symptoms before you actually begin play. Just don't do it. It's an idiot idea. And honestly, if you're doing it with the belief that it is to help your own mental state, then I would tell you that while you getting some recreation in may assist in your mental state, you are also putting hundreds or potentially thousands of others at risk. Your mental state is not worth that risk for anybody else, and there are other ways for you to be able to recharge or to relax. It is a reality. It is not something that we can play with. It's a very simple hot take to start, but I think that there's enough people who I've seen tweeting recently that I can be relatively sure to say this. It isn't fucking worth it. You think that there's fire behind me? There's fire inside me, and it is desperate to make its way out. Desperate to make its way out. And honestly, this first hot take isn't much of a hot take at all, because if anybody understands anything about science or the way that pandemics or epidemics spread, then they would already know this, and it wouldn't be news to anybody that we shouldn't be doing any mass gatherings. I have loved ones who currently cannot do what they themselves have chosen to dedicate their entire lives to because of this pandemic, and if they can handle the loss of their entire world, you can handle the loss of one of your games. I am not taking 1d6 fire damage per turn. I have Kiss of Helios active, Kaiser Omnic. We're going all the way on this one. Excuse me. Family gatherings like Thanksgiving and Christmas, I've already told my family that we're nuts if we think that we can even try to make it work somehow. We can't. We simply can't, and we shouldn't. The people who would be gathering in my family are all over the age of 60, which means that they're already at higher risk. And as much as it pains me to not be able to see my family, especially during these special gatherings, we're not going to do it because we're not idiots. I don't want to end up accidentally being the cause for one of my family members' ultimate sickness or death just because we needed to get together to share some food. It's not worth it. It's absolutely not worth it. And I have seen that people are saying, but we have to support these LARPs right now because a lot of them require the funds in order to maintain and to keep going during this time because they couldn't run. And I absolutely agree that it is important to try to support the people who are running the games that you love. But to support them by actually attending one of their games is not the way to do it. Buy their merch, give them donations, pledge that you will be there as soon as it's possible, that there is a safe and effective vaccine so that we can all start getting together again. But don't actually go. Because as much as a LARP is a wonderful thing, it is not worth getting a lot of people sick or killed. Yeah, exactly. We're just don't do Thanksgiving this year. It absolutely sucks, and nobody is saying that it doesn't. But it is unnecessary. It is not life critical. And if something is truly life critical, then you need to find an alternate arrangement, because life critical means that maybe you need to start cohabitating with that person and enter them into your bubble, as opposed to, well, we have to do it because it's Thanksgiving. No. There is no disease that can only trigger if you miss out on having a specific meal on a specific day. It's just not worth it. Well, and as long as we're talking about LARPing, I'm going to point this out. If you are engaged in a LARP, and if that LARP doesn't put safety first and foremost for everybody at all times, if you don't have it, if you're not greeted with safety when you arrive, and if you are not being reminded about safety throughout, it is not a LARP that is worth your time. I have been guilty of this. I have run LARPs for many, many years. And while we did try to make sure that everybody was safe, we did it more on the down low. We made it a private conversation that we would have with people, saying that if you ever needed any help or assistance, you could come to me or come to another member of the staff, and we would talk. We would make sure that things were right for you, when we should have been screaming it from the rooftops and making it completely open. And we were not doing that. So that's why, at this time, I would say that if you are attending a game and safety is not being important, ask. Ask why. Start insisting on safety as something that's important to you and to everybody else around you. Because live action role-playing, especially, more so than even normal tabletop or online role-playing, can put you in a vulnerable position, because not only are you putting your emotional self at risk, but your physical self can be at risk as well. These are often events where people are live fighting. You don't think that you want to make sure that the rules are being enforced, that everybody has an equal footing when it comes to the weapons that are being used or the armor that is being required? You don't think that you want to have a storytelling or GM team that is there to make sure that everybody is having as fun a time as possible, that no one is being singled out, that nobody is being harassed or creeped on? It's happened too many times. I've seen too many horror stories. And to be honest, one horror story is enough. Cut it out. There's a big reason why I hesitate to join in on LARPs that are large scale. Because I don't necessarily feel safe either for myself or for other players who are present. I have it easy. I am a cisgendered, heterosexual, white male. I don't have to fear my privilege being taken away from me from practically anybody. So, if that means that I'm feeling nervous about attending a LARP that isn't safety, it shows that it's something that has to be paid attention to, not because my opinion is more important than anyone else's, but because I am the person who logistically and realistically would be the most safe, because I'm also statistically and realistically the person who is most likely to be the offender in this situation. I know this, and we have to stop it. Once you cross a certain threshold of people, there will be at least one asshole, because that's just statistics, I guess. I mean, look. I know for a fact that when you're working on a team, you can have somebody who is absolutely brilliant, but also an asshole on your team. It is not worth it. It is not worth entertaining an asshole just because you think that you can get a better result out of them, or because they may have skills that you don't think can be found anywhere else. The reality is that those skills can probably be found in those people who are already being oppressed or marginalized, and you haven't had the effort, or you haven't taken the effort to look and find them. And they can't speak up as loudly as other people can because they just don't have the equality that we desire. Therefore, assholes are a problem. And if you have an asshole in your game, kick them the fuck out. Because if you can talk to them and you can make them aware of their being an asshole and they can't course correct, you are actively ruining the game for everybody else, including yourself, so that you can accommodate and try to teach one person. When sometimes what an asshole needs to learn is to hit rock bottom and for them to crawl their own fucking selves out of that hole. It is not your responsibility to make sure that every geek or every nerd or every gamer or every person in your social sphere is well taken care of. It is your job to make sure that everybody is being treated fairly. And if there is somebody in your group who is not treating others fairly, who is being an active detriment, they deserve to leave. And you can kick them out. Do not fall onto the fallacy that by kicking somebody out, you are somehow the evil person because you are the ostracizer, or that by kicking them out, you're ensuring that they will never improve. By holding on to them and coddling them, you are in essence telling them that their behavior is acceptable to a certain degree, and that the price that they have to pay is a couple of dirty looks, or maybe the occasional unpleasant and awkward conversation, instead of actually fixing the fucking problem. Don't put up with them. I have done so way too many times in my life. I am now privileged in that I can play games with people who I've vetted in the past and who I know are people who I will enjoy playing with. I don't get to play with assholes anymore because I don't have to. I do not rely on them. I also live in an area where there are enough people that if I wanted to start a game, I can start it. I can find enough players. Not everybody is in this position, but I guarantee you that it is not worth keeping an asshole just because it's your one shot at being able to play a game. There will be others. And even if you don't want to, you can find people online or in other communities who will be able to step in for that person who's being a total shit stain on your existence. Assholeness is infective by permission, yes. If half the people in the world are good and half are assholes, do your best to make one asshole a little less of an ass and you shift the balance to the right side. The best way to make sure that somebody isn't an asshole is to call them out on it and not put up with it at all. If somebody shows up to your game and starts falling back into their old habits, they get kicked out until the next session where they might be able to come back. But it is only through absolute vigilance and being able to be secure in your belief that you can judge an asshole. Is that asshole ever going to change? Most of the time, we change only because of outside influences that are being placed upon us. It is our environment and our universe that enacts change on us. If nothing changes around an asshole, they have no reason or incentive to cease becoming an asshole. They have to learn. It's up to you to make sure that they do that. I'm not saying if there's a notice and no change, it's on them. We have a bit of an obligation to make that notice. So absolutely, the Crosshair, part of your way that you deal with an asshole is by telling them that they are an asshole and giving them specific instances in which they were being an asshole. Just generally coming out to somebody and saying, you're making people uncomfortable at the table isn't enough. You can come to somebody and say, the way that you have been treating this other person is unacceptable. This is why it's unacceptable. I do not put up with this behavior. You need to change or you need to leave. And if you don't give that specific information, then that asshole isn't necessarily going to know what they need to do in order to fit in with the rest of society. Now, I am not saying that if somebody is challenged in dealing with other people socially, that they don't deserve to have a social life, or that you cannot help somebody who is struggling socially. But at the same time, this person has to be demonstrating a willingness to learn and a willingness to accept the mistakes that they've made and to correct them. There is no excuse for making somebody else at the table uncomfortable to the degree that then they wish that they weren't sitting at the table. That's not how the social contract works. It is something that we just have to put up with and deal with. Now, that being said, I have a very specific kind of asshole that I want to call out, because I think that they perhaps are unduly persecuted, and it's something that we have to watch out for. I'm talking about cheaters. There are cheaters in all kinds of role-playing games. There are cheaters in online games, in LARPs, in tabletop, in person, and through the means of digital communication. There are people who fudge die rolls. There are people who accidentally forget to mark off resources on their sheet. People who spend a bit more experience than they actually had access to. People who don't call the shots that they clearly feel on their own body while they're in combat. But I want people to understand that there are times that people cheat, and it is not because they simply wish to gain an advantage over other players. Some people will cheat because they believe that they are being treated unfairly, that they have been somehow wronged by the game. If that's true, perhaps their cheating is a symptom of a problem that is actually one of yours. Are you creating an environment at the table where somebody feels that the only way that they can get ahead is to cheat? As a player, are you constantly overshadowing another player? Are you always making the decisions for that player so that they don't feel like they are contributing enough? Have you somehow min-maxed the game to the point where you can be the only PC who has any effect on the game itself? And therefore somebody else feels that the only way that they can somehow turn that spotlight towards them, even for just a moment, is to cheat? Are you a GM who makes their encounter so difficult that it feels like no player has the ability to succeed unless they somehow start forgetting rules that are inconvenient to them? Have you marginalized one character to the point where they feel that they can no longer affect the story and therefore need to find some extra help because they're not getting it from you? It happens. It happens more than I would care to admit in my career of running games, and especially in LARP play, that sometimes people who were cheating weren't being careless, they were being deliberate about it, but what they weren't doing was being malicious. They were trying to find an edge in a game that wasn't giving them any, where they were finding that they could not have what they thought was a fair experience, and so they were trying to create equality or equality themselves. They may be misguided. They may have had ample opportunity to speak to a game master to try to resolve their problems, or even to use their word holes to work things out with players who might be making them feel badly. But they didn't. Instead, they took another option. Now, I'm not saying that you need to put up with cheating. Damaging the integrity of a game can be difficult for the GM to handle, and it can also wreck the game for every other player who realizes that because they are playing by the rules, they are at a disadvantage. At the same time, if somebody is cheating, try to discover the reason behind it. An example that I can give you is an online game that I was running where there were characters who had accumulated years of experience over others, and those people who were new to the game or who had to create new characters were finding themselves in a position where they couldn't actually get anything done, that they weren't allowed to do any kind of role-playing because all the other characters who had much higher experience levels were doing everything first, pushing them to the back and saying, wait, it's too dangerous, don't go forward. We play in role-playing games in order to feel danger, in order to have that kind of rush, that we are taking risks, life and death perhaps, but not in a serious physical manner, but only in the story itself. These characters were feeling like they weren't even allowed to take risks, and I started to notice that their character sheets began being padded with a bit more experience than they once had, or that they were ignoring things that they needed to pay attention to, status effects that should have been affecting them or whatnot. And it was simply because they felt disenfranchised. So yes, cheating is awful, but it isn't the one strike and you're out offense that I think people make it out to be. It is a symptom of a more serious problem. And if that problem lies not within the player who is cheating, but within the game itself, perhaps you owe it to not only you and the other players, but to that player who feels the need to cheat, to reevaluate your own game and fix what's wrong. This is also why I trust the people around me more so online to let me know, bun, stop that, especially some of the people I know around here are great at telling me if I step the line. Crosshair, I don't think that you are even remotely the kind of person who I'm talking about. But being aware is also a good thing. Kaiser Omnic says, are people who read the rules of paranoia there to be terminated? Absolutely. Part of the point is that you don't read the rules of paranoia. Real Wall says, one of my friends got accused of cheating with his die rolls. I've watched his die rolls very closely since then, and by God, he really is just that lucky. It is possible. I will point out that over the period of time, people will have hot streaks and cold streaks, and people tend to remember streaks more than they remember standard distributions. And people also tend to remember more often when they are the loser. So either your own bad rolls or another player's excellent rolls. It is just human nature that this is how we remember facts, and it weighs us in a bias that might indicate cheating when in fact there's none. Finally, a friend computer usually asks and corrects people before zapping them. Friend computer is a good example. It depends. Did your player get his favorite magic item only to have it fuse his hands together? Fuck that player. How do you handle the soft cheating? Oops, I forgot my wound penalty, and did I spend that willpower? I don't think I did. Because if you call it out as cheating, you gotta know it was a mistake. People can make mistakes. People can make honest mistakes all the time, and that's fine. People can also make mistakes repeatedly because they are simply distracted, or because they don't have a head for numbers, or because they aren't familiar enough yet with the game's rules. In that particular case, instead of accusing them of cheating, you need to say, hey, you keep forgetting this particular rule, or I find that you are constantly forgetting this specific element of your character or its sheet or a weakness. Let's try to focus on making sure that we can remember that for the good of everybody. Because then if it is a genuine mistake, the player will move to correct that mistake. But somebody who is constantly making mistakes, somebody for whom it is like a barrier that they cannot surmount, there are two options. Either that person genuinely is incredibly scatterbrained, in which case a game of this complexity may not be for them, or they are cheating. I hate to put it this way because I don't wish to accuse anybody of cheating when they're not. It's one of the elements of game design that is most difficult for online play. Reporting a player for bad behavior is one thing. Reporting a player because they happened to have a bad game and perhaps went on tilt is another. And it's more about noticing a trend over time. If a player is making that mistake a lot in one session, it could be that that particular session they are distracted. If they are making this mistake across multiple sessions, even with repeated warnings, that is an indication that they are in fact cheating. Hot take, wound penalties are a bad mechanic. It depends on the game that you're trying to play. A wound penalty is the sort of thing that can feel really badly about a game where the intention is that you are supposed to be able to roll over your opponents, or a game that puts more emphasis on combat. Because if a game puts emphasis on combat more so than anything else, then it indicates that realism isn't necessarily what you're going for. What you're going for is an exciting system. Wound penalties in games where there is more than just combat become important because then there is a consequence to suffering damage in combat by spending the resources of your health, because you may not see combat for another while yet, but at the same time there are lasting consequences to that. However, I will point out that wound penalties can often be way too harsh. The issue of getting hurt and then finding that immediately you are no longer effective in combat means that players start adopting an ultimately defensive mindset, or they begin to min-max in an attempt to get the first hit in and therefore be effective before they're effectively removed from combat because they've taken one hit. How about the 7th C mechanic where wounds give you penalties and bonuses? That is an interesting idea. Unfortunately, 7th C's mechanics don't do it for me. There's a lot of good ideas in there, but I don't think that there's a lot of effective execution. I believe that more playtesting was warranted and perhaps more of an eye towards overall design. It's possible that the playtest that happened for 7th C was insular, and the players who managed to make those rules work weren't necessarily indicative of the worldwide role-playing audience as a whole. If it's the point of the game, then it's fine, but I don't like realistic wounds for the sake of realism. Role-playing is not about realism. It isn't. Role-playing is about experience. And the experiences can feel real, but they are not. The purposes of role-playing is to make sure that something is not real. Because if it is real, it is no longer role-playing. It is reality. And reality is specifically what people are trying to avoid. Role-playing is an effort to create a story, explore a character, think up puzzles, or solve them, but in ways that do not have the stakes of real life. And as soon as you make something too realistic, you are no longer actually giving somebody a fantasy. You're giving them a spreadsheet. Mistrich loves wound penalties. They feel realer than HP, and they don't feel as dangerous as named wounds like Fate and Scion. And players feel much less heroic with a broken R -3 than a wound penalty of -3. HP, as in the system that Dungeons & Dragons use, works very well for Dungeons & Dragons because the point of D&D, for the most part, in terms of its mechanics, is to play through combat encounters. I'm not saying that your D&D game only includes combat, and I'm not saying that you cannot roleplay in a D&D game. What I am saying is that the majority of its crunch is focused around encounters and the mathematical game that comes with it. And therefore, increasing somebody's load by giving them wound penalties through hit points means that they become less interested in what a lot of the game is focused around. So it is, in fact, a way to make sure that players do not lose interest in what the game does best, which is combat. It's funny, I'd feel more heroic with a named wound. Achieving great things despite having a broken arm sounds heroic. Just seeing my bonuses go down doesn't feel heroic to me. Kaiser Omnic, in this way, the way that I handle this, if the game doesn't have a specific mechanic for this, is that if somebody has suffered a grievous scar, then at that point, I make sure that that scar is known. In Exaltwitch, I took one of Jorik's eyes. I made sure that he knew that he had lost his eye. It wasn't simply a, you are now at a -2 penalty to everything. It was, you have lost an eye. Think about how that affects you and your character going forward. But to do so in the middle of combat from some random attack makes it a little bit difficult, because then it can bog combat down and make it harder for somebody to immerse themselves in combat and make it run smoothly if they are constantly trying to juggle whether or not their current wounds affect the actions that they're attempting to take. It also increases the number of arguments that you'll hear, that someone will say that a broken arm wouldn't necessarily apply in this situation, or that a character must withdraw because the concept of a broken arm is an issue. Remember that people who broke bones before modern medicine were at a severe disadvantage, and that there was a very good chance that additional complications would occur. Merely having an open wound was an issue because the idea of sterilization or of protection against infection was not a thing. And to be able to say that D&D, therefore, brings in a bit of modern sensibility because people no longer are at risk of dying simply because they got nicked on a battlefield, or that we don't go over how every time that there are corpses, they have to be somehow specifically disposed of because otherwise they could bring disease. Well, that's just because D&D isn't a game that's meant to be that realistic. What, in your opinion, is the divergence from the paradigm? 7th Sea seems very traditional to me. 7th Sea 2nd Edition is a great game if you're able to stand aside from a common paradigm of the regular design of role-playing game. Most people can't do that. It's because the dominant paradigm that is out there, it depends. But to say this is a fantastic game is one thing. To say it's a fantastic game for a niche audience is another. I'm a big fan of voluntary wounds as a mechanic. I agree. Narrative currency as well as the immediate lack of failure. Yeah. The designer himself backtracked on it. Usually a pretty indication that something's wrong. There's also the question of game flow. Even if you go hyper-realistic into someone losing an eye or broken arm, the game would become a bit stale if you had half the party in bed for 2 weeks. Yes. It is something that a lot of people don't realize, but just because you want something out of a game does not mean that it will make the game better. And even if we give you what you want, you will not necessarily have a better time. This is a good example of the idea of game design being something that is done not by committee of the players, but by the designers themselves. They can hear feedback and act upon it, but at the same time, you need to be able to trust that your designer may have actually thought of this situation and even perhaps tested a build where your situation was resolved and discovered that it came up with additional problems that they did not wish to put up with. I'll also point out that people who make design decisions aren't idiots. At least I hope they're not. Because there's way too many times that I see somebody on the internet complaining about a design decision and coming up with the first and most obvious solution to that problem. I don't know whether people realize this consciously, but what they're saying at that point is that for some reason the designer of the game did not think of the most obvious thing that could possibly have been brought up. And that somehow that's all that separates a designer from a normal person, is the fact that they happen to get the job first more than something else. Even death isn't a long-term problem in D&D. A lot of people have specifically found that introducing death to D&D makes it better. Critical Role, in fact, has rules that make resurrections a lot harder to accomplish, and that there's always the chance that they will fail, because the idea of taking death out of a game reduces a lot of that narrative pull or scope. The other thing is, if somebody dies in such a way that you can't recover the body, then it becomes either everybody else has to focus the entire story around this one dead person, or they have to move on, leaving that dead person behind, creating an unpleasant situation where some players have to decide the fate of another player's character. Players fought the sea serpent, managed to chase them off. Excellent, Kung Fu Fenris. I do like the changeling updates. I like those house rules. We use them in my Saturday game. I find that as much as I am reluctant to kill players, if a game has no ability to create death, that has to be an understood mechanic of the game. Because otherwise, what you're doing is robbing stakes from the players. And stakes are what creates compelling drama. Why don't you just make it like this, much simpler? I spent 2 months thinking of all the scenarios and testing them, and the design I made it was the least problematic overall, not just for graphics. The crosshair, you understand better than I do this situation, but it is an issue that plagues designers all over, that somebody believes that just because they believe they have experience in the game that they're playing, that they somehow understand all of the design ramifications for even small decisions. But it isn't the truth. It can't be. It won't be. Other hot takes, let's see. Dice towers. Dice towers are fun, and they can have sentimental value, and they can have ornamental value, but ultimately they are not necessary unless you have a cheater at the table. You do not need to take into account that a die has poor rolling mechanics and that a dice tower is the only way to solve it. If you are finding that you have a dice tower and it is the only way that you can justify having good rolls, that's because your players aren't rolling dice correctly. I will also point out that if you are standing there with dice in your hand and shaking them for a long time and believing that this is the only way that you can create a random result, you are in fact delaying the game for everybody. Sometimes a little bit of hesitation or a little bit of a delay can create dramatic tension, but often you're just merely dragging the game down by making every die roll, instead of taking 1 or 2 seconds, take 9 or 10 instead. Roll your fucking dice. It is not worth just having It isn't worth just having everybody constantly have that tactile sensation and dragging out their own turn. Sirens for this hot take. See, Kung Fu Fenris cheated a lot as a player in his mid-20s. Cheaters are not necessarily bad people. There are often reasons behind people who are cheating. The point is to try to address the issue before immediately discarding them. Oh, you wouldn't believe how hot these takes are coming out. Here's one. If you're playing in a game and your game master is constantly the one who is buying all the supplemental materials for the game, you should consider subsidizing your GM. As much as I hate to put it, as much as I hate the idea that GMs are somehow different or apart from players, on the one hand, they are, and I need to get a little bit better about accepting that. And on the other hand, if a GM is the one who is investing most of the money in this game, and the players are the ones who are benefiting from it, then it is not simply because the game master's duty is to have all these games, or even that the game master is the one who gets to enjoy the books because they're the ones who are reading them, but it is in fact that the game master is creating the universe for everybody else and also shouldering more of the financial burden. This matters less for people who are of a certain age. Obviously, if you have the disposable income, then a book isn't necessarily the most expensive thing on the block. However, if you are young, perhaps you have not yet established a career, perhaps you are older but have experienced financial difficulties past or present, consider making sure that everybody at the table shoulders the burden of paying for the game's entertainment. All in all, even spending hundreds of dollars on books and miniatures and maps can end up being very cheap when all is said and done and the rest of the game is finished. The number of hours that you got out of the game is enough to justify that much of an expense, especially if you compare that expense to the cost of a video game or a movie, or even just a night out on the town. But I see too many people believe that the GM is the one who should be spending the money on the books because they, in fact, are the ones who are taking the initiative to buy them. Consider subsidizing your GMs. It is the best way to ensure that everybody continues to remain happy. If you buy the supplements for yourself, that's fine. I used to cheat for wrong, even if good intentions reasons. I used to fudge my rules to make myself less effective because being too good felt like against the table. Yes. If you like a game, buy it, then they'll make more as long as you can afford it. So Grubermensch points out something else, and that is the rampant piracy that exists among games. As somebody who has had their content pirated, and as somebody who has at various points in their life pirated content, what do you think all of the music in Exaltwitch and Changeling the Streaming are, if not pirating? It becomes very difficult for me to say that piracy overall is a black and white crime. But I will say that if you do enjoy a game and you enjoy the experiences that it's given you, the only way to ensure that it will continue to happen is if you support the creator. And the creator of the game will be supported if you purchase the merchandise that comes with it. Typically the source books, either in PDF or in physical form, or the accessories that come with the book, or whatever. Unfortunately, the role-playing community does not yet quite understand that the people who develop the games that they love often do it as a side hustle, and they aren't in fact doing it for the money at all. Many of the people who have written for role-playing games in the past have found themselves in the hole. And it's because of the love of the game and the love of designing for an audience that forces them to do this. So as much as I can say that, yes, you can download a book to find out if you like it first before you actually buy it, it is worth making sure that you support the creators who you believe deserve your money. You vote with your money, with your dollars or your rubles or your yen. Or creating supplementary materials yourself, absolutely. Gift cards for GMs to book suppliers are great holiday presents even if you're not currently in a game. Aragorn knows what's up. You can even get gift certificates for online bookstores for role-playing games like DriveThruRPG. More than anything, if you want to keep your GM interested, make sure that they have access to the content that they are going to want to integrate into your game. Honestly, I'm guilty, but I'm also like a conscientious pirate. I download something, see if I like it, then buy it. A lot of piracy is also about the access. It isn't necessarily about the price. People have found that people are more likely to download music when it is hard for them to get a hold of the tracks that they want compared to just simply being able to pay for it. Telling somebody that they can have a subscription where they can get access to basically all the music that they wish and that it is at that point legal isn't necessarily going to help them unless that subscription also makes it easy to find the music you want and to hold on to it. The same is true of role-playing games. PDFs are an important part of today's gaming, especially because more and more gaming is happening online and on a computer, and access to rules can be awfully easy if you can just search a PDF's text file. But there are games that aren't available in PDF. As an example that's directly affecting us here at RPG Clinic, Star Wars Edge of the Empire and the other FFG Star Wars games do not have PDF editions because of licensing issues. And this makes it difficult for us to be able to run a game online because it makes it harder for us to find the information that we need. And we had to go through great expense to procure a copy of the core book because there were no copies available in the country. And we had to import them from another location, thus not only incurring duty, but also a brokerage charge from UPS, which ended up costing us an additional $50 simply to get the book across the border. But we did it because we believe in the game. But I'm also going to admit that we did find the PDFs that were scans for these games, which we used to make sure that this was going to end up being a game that we wanted to play. Because the only other option that we had was to drop $200 on finding a core. Have you considered getting affiliate links for DriveThruRPG for RPG Clinic? I'm not sure if we're nearly popular enough for that to be a thing just yet. Now that we've rebranded and we're rebuilding our community, hopefully we'll be able to continue to expand our community. But affiliate links for a very, very small number of people, I'm not certain that they would go for that. Certain companies don't release stuff in Finland and I can't get it otherwise. Exactly. Being able to say, I can't access your product and so therefore I must steal it. As much as I can understand that the legality of it is difficult, it is very hard morally for me to look down on somebody if it's simply, I can't get a hold of something because it is unavailable in my place of residence. Where did you end up buying it from? We bought it from Fantasy Flight directly, OSUB. We ordered the book directly from Asmodee, technically, because Asmodee owns Fantasy Flight now. But that's the way it is. To be honest, there are folks who pirate systems because they like the game but don't want to give money to the company for whatever ethical reason too. So, here's perhaps a legitimate hot take that I'm going to throw out here. And it is something that I'm going to point out that when I say this, it is not intended to target any individual person. Do not try to read this into me trying to come down on anybody, but it is a reality. I have seen people attempt to boycott game companies before. Role-playing companies, video game companies, when cancel culture coming after specific pieces of media. And unfortunately, I have to tell you that as much as it is something worthwhile to vote with your dollars about the games that you want, boycotting an entire company, publishing company, because of an open scandal is a dangerous thing to do because you, A, don't necessarily know that this hasn't happened in every goddamn role-playing company that exists, because a lot of it has, and B, that by stopping, by ceasing to support those works, you may be in fact hurting the people you're trying to protect, the people who are in fact making the game itself. It is a difficult and complicated situation, and I don't have the answer for you. But I can say that basing all of your product decisions on the actions of a small group of individuals as part of an overall larger company, or to refuse the apologies of those companies, or to refuse to accept that change is slow to come to large companies, means that you are in fact perhaps willingly blinding yourself in an attempt to feel righteous. The reason I'm saying this is because I have played a lot of games, and I have played games that I know have had troubling content in them. Content in the games themselves, or that have had troubling things surrounding those games in the corporate structure. The reality is that role-playing developers are often paid very little. The artists that work on the books that you love are often also paid very little. It is also a reality that there have been mistakes that have been made. Horrible and egregious mistakes. However, there's also an opinion in the world that apologies and efforts to do better for some reason aren't enough, and that the only thing that can satisfy is a total dismantling of the entire company around it. I myself struggle when I consume art, when I know that the artist, or perhaps even the artist's patrons, are troublesome. And at the same time, the art exists. And there are things that I can do with that art. I can transform it and create something good out of it. It is hard to handle this. It is absolutely difficult. And the thing is, I don't believe that somebody who is making a stand is necessarily doing the wrong thing. It is important that you, of course, handle your own morality. But I will say that it is a much more complicated issue, because if you seek enough, you'll find evidence of wrongdoing everywhere. And that while it is incredibly important that we expose that wrongdoing, and that we also make sure that companies who ignore that wrongdoing suffer for it, I do not necessarily believe that it is worth a total shutdown of an entire group of individuals because of the bad actions of one or two, especially if the others were unaware or were incapable of doing anything about it. UPS likes to make money, so they charge outrageous brokerage fees. You can do clearance yourself, but it involves jumping through a bunch of hoops. Absolutely. And Asmodee never gave us the option. There's a lot more shit that needs to be fucked over. Games need to be given corrections, not lynched, and sometimes opinions differ. So there are shitbags out there. There are total shitbags out there, and it is completely important that we bring them to task. That is not the hot take that I'm trying to say. Like the Zach S. controversy, the fact that it came out and it was slow to be reacted to, and then finally the stuff that Zach S. worked on has been pulled, and there have been apologies. But the point is that the work was being done. And it is also something that I think that not people realize is that as enraged as I can get when I hear about stories like this, I also know that if you are a company, if you're a person working at a company who is now under assault from the internet, it is in fact sometimes difficult for you to immediately say, I will do what the crowd is asking for. Partially because, just like game development, it's hard for somebody to necessarily know all the ins and outs. And the second thing is because then you risk making a mistake again, and then you are constantly doing things. Taking the time to make sure that you're doing something correctly is often seen in the public as dragging your feet, when in reality it may be the thing that you need to do to figure out what's going on. Now, as a hot take, this is exposing me, and I understand that. But I do also want to make sure that people understand that in no way should this be tolerated, and that speaking out about it is important. But we also have to start looking at our society in terms of, once the egregious factor is removed, what steps can we take towards forgiveness? And that forgiveness is not, the onus is not on the people, but on the offender to find a way to seek it. But we can't be closed off about forgiveness, because if we just end up destroying everything that we love anytime anything happens that casts any kind of shadow on it, then we have nothing. To wit, Gary Gygax was very, very opinionated about who was playing his game. First of all, it wasn't his game anyway. He basically took it from somebody else and made tweaks. His contribution was important, and of course, every game needs a publisher, but the way that he stole it was unacceptable. But he also believed that women wouldn't be able to have the brains to play his game, that they were wired differently. And if we were to say that because he was being a misogynistic asshole, then no one should play D&D, that's oversimplifying the issue and removing the work of hundreds and thousands of people who have contributed to that game since and wrested it from his hands and created something a lot better out of it. So, just be careful. By canceling something without understanding the full ramifications of it, you may be doing more harm than good occasionally. D&D is making a lot of progress. Yes, and after enough time, like with Zach S., you know who's still supporting him, and then you can boycott them forever. Yep, that is true. But remember that if you have made a mistake and you cannot seek forgiveness for that mistake because you believe that you haven't committed an error, then that's on you. If you made a mistake and then expect other people to accept your apology without actually putting the work in, that's on you. If you make a mistake and you can't figure out how to make amends, then you need to start listening to people and discovering how you can potentially do such a thing. But no one owes you forgiveness. No one owes you forgiveness just because you realize that something has been done wrong. But I do urge people to consider forgiveness. Because if we don't consider forgiveness, then even the games that have proven so wonderful for us for so long will be lost. Dungeons & Dragons first and foremost. But most other games have these skeletons in the closet as well. There's a bit of a time frame issue. If someone said something in the 80s, that has to be taken into consideration too, especially in forgiveness, for sure. I'm very much of two minds on this because I'm wary of not imposing consequences on people for choosing to platform bad people. So again, Grubermensch, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that if you are actively trying to protect people who are doing bad things, then you deserve consequences. But also, I would point out that if you have then since tried to make amends and you have made a good faith effort to fix things, then it is at that point something that needs to be reopened for debate. The idea that if somebody commits a mistake, then they are done forever is a dangerous thing. That's why this is a hot take, because it's an uncomfortable thing to talk about out loud. I'm not suggesting, for instance, that anybody should give Kevin Spacey a job ever again. I think he's done. And I don't think there's anything that he can do to correct the wrongs that he has committed to allow him to return to a life where he gets to be showered with admiration and affection. That's it. It's done. But I'll also point out that the films that he made were made by hundreds of people, not one. If you like The Usual Suspects but find that you can't watch it because Kevin Spacey makes you uncomfortable, that's okay. But if you decide that you don't want to watch The Usual Suspects because you think that that's supporting Kevin Spacey, then that means that you're also not supporting the other hundreds of people who made that film. Same with role-playing games. And that's the problem. We haven't figured it out yet. There are various possible reactions to a situation, and boycott as a strategy for all of those is just too rigid. Potentially, yes. What I'm talking about is publishers, media, etc. should be properly incentivized not to promote people who do harm, and fundamentally the only way to influence companies is to hurt their revenue. Completely, Grubermensch. I agree. But there's a difference between saying, I won't buy your products until you fix this, or I will never buy your products ever again, or I will not only never buy your products ever again, but I will also judge and look down on people who do. We all have our battles to fight. We all have battles that are very important to us. And in that case, when we get to that point, we have to start realizing that there are so many different things to consider that it's impossible to get an idea of somebody's core beliefs or tenets just through one conversation or even one application of what they've chosen to purchase. There are causes that are very important to maintain. But if I donated to every single cause that I thought would possibly benefit and causes that I believed in, then I wouldn't be able to support any of them because there are just so many. So sometimes we pick and choose about the people we wish to support and about the people that we wish to uplift. And there are sometimes we have to pick and choose about the things we leave behind. But it isn't as simple as saying, I don't like this, and therefore anyone else who does not like this or anyone else who does like this is wrong. And it's also not easy to say, this person has done wrong, therefore I will scorch everything that that person has ever touched, including the people who were innocent of that crime, and I will also ensure that anybody else who does not do the exact same thing is considered lesser. It is a problem. It is a hot take. And that's what I promised in this session. But again, everybody's done it. I've done it. I have boycotted something arbitrarily, right? And perhaps it's not necessarily fair. I've voted with my dollars before. But as an example, I don't support the restaurant chain Chick-fil-A for many different reasons that I'm not going to get into here. But I also don't think that I'd hate somebody who decided that they really wanted to go to Chick-fil-A and buy one of their sandwiches. Adam Baldwin is just a small part of Firefly. Exactly, Kaiser Omnic, right? Like, it is difficult to say that something is not worth consuming any longer simply because there's somebody who was involved who you didn't like, or who's done something terrible. I mean, forgiveness is the thing that I'm trying to point out here. And even though forgiveness is a strange thing for a hot take, it does exist. Without the capacity for forgiveness, then we are doing ourselves a disservice and damage. And that's not necessarily something that I wish to promote. I definitely promote destroying the institutions that have brought us to where we are today. Fuck the patriarchy, fuck privilege. Black Lives Matter, Trans Lives Matter, all of those things are incredibly important. But I will also say that I have seen people who have changed, genuinely changed their opinions that I once thought of as horrific. And that if I was not capable of forgiveness or a reevaluation of those people, then in fact, they have no incentive to change, but instead only dig their heels into their beliefs because they've already chosen their side and that there's no way for them to come across to the other one. Forgiveness is an essential part of social change. Hilariously Chic is my one rage spot. Normally I can be, I disagree with you, but you do you, but I silently judge folks who announce they're going to Chic and squint at them. I don't actually know what Chic is. I'm also not saying necessarily that you can't like silently judge people yourselves. I'm talking about like when you scorch somebody for something that is arbitrary. Oh, Chick-fil-A. Okay, sorry. It's actually spelt this way, which is strange. But yeah, I lived very close to a Chick-fil-A while I was living in the United States, and I never went. And I did that because the corporate culture was one that I disagreed with. Now, there's a difference between corporate culture and, of course, the person who owns a company. The person who owns Domino's is a shitbag. But at the same time, the amount of money that I would give that person if I bought a pizza at Domino's is very, very small. The amount of money that still goes to the people who make the pizza, who make the food, that make the ingredients that make up the pizza, the person who delivers the pizza, the person who builds the Domino's thing, it goes to a lot of other places as well. And if I start saying that I can't spend money on something because it might fall in the hands of somebody who I disagree with, then unfortunately you should basically agree that you can't spend money almost anywhere, because there's no way for you to guarantee what everybody's political beliefs are every time you spend money. So in a way, be responsible, be ethical, but also understand that it is impossible for you to be perfect 100% of the time. First part of anti-fascism is knowing that your fight stops once they stop being horrific. That goes for a lot of places in life. So I'm not making any kind of judgment call on protests right now, other than I think that the people who are protesting are doing something brave and fighting for something that we need to fight for. But I am of the opinion, and unfortunately I'm operating from my own position of privilege, so I have the privilege of being able to consider this, that forgiveness is something that needs to be considered at some point. There is no ethical consumption in late-stage capitalism. Yep. I'm kind of impressed. It seems like his name was Robert Paulson, which, by the way, here's a hot take for you. You're allowed to enjoy Fight Club, but if you believe that it has a message that is supposed to empower masculinity, you miss the fucking point, dude. There are way too many people who watch things like V for Vendetta or Fight Club, things that have big statements to make about society themselves, and just completely miss the fucking point because they see something that looks cool. Also, Fight Club the movie is better than Fight Club the book, by far, just so you know. But yeah, start actually evaluating the things that you watch, and don't just start thinking that it's amazing just because you think it looks neat. I wrote a goddamn minor thesis on that exact topic. Even Fallout has that issue. So I hate that movie. I went to high school at the time when Fight Club was apparently every guy's idea of a make-out movie. Awful, Aragorn. No wonder you hate it. Fight Club is a movie that, to me, speaks of the damage that men have done to themselves. Straight up. It's not it shouldn't be an easy watch. And while it has an interesting storytelling twist, and you might like the way that it's shot, or you might like the whatever, it's not a make-out movie, and it's definitely not something that should be copied. I'm going to do a hot take. It's also fine if you don't want to get into politics, issues, etc. It's fine as long as you then stay the fuck out of it. I'd rather you got into things, but you don't have to. So that's true. Somebody who runs in, says you're wrong, and then runs out laughing has not contributed meaningfully to any conversation at all. I would also point out that if I say anything and you disagree with it and you tell me, I'm not going to hate you right away. I mean, unless you're like, no, trans rights are not people rights. Then at that point I might be like, well, we're going to have a conversation. But disagreeing with me is not necessarily an indication that I don't like you. And also, disagreeing with me might be the next step to proving that I'm wrong, because I've been wrong a lot. I've been wrong many, many times in my life, and I will continue to be wrong and continue to reevaluate my position. One of the things that politicians try to avoid is seeing as flip-flopping, whereas, in my opinion, if a politician gets more information and then changes their mind about a position because they now have new information to act upon, that's the sign of somebody who has shown wisdom, not cowardice. You don't need to get into any political issue, but maintaining that nothing is political in RPGs and media would be as political. Absolutely. Politics are in everything. They're in sports, they're in games, they're in role-playing games, they're in streams, they're in Twitch. Look, here's something. I'm currently streaming on Amazon. Essentially, Amazon owns Twitch, which means that if you spend money to support me or support anyone else on this channel by buying bits or subscriptions, some of that money is going to Jeff Bezos. Which sucks. It really sucks. But at the same time, that's kind of the reality. And if we shut everything out, then that's also not necessarily going to be good, because then it means that I don't have a platform to create on anymore. People's ideas of make-out movies make me cringe. I remember hearing about how many people went to The Ring as a make-out movie. Amazon struggles, yeah. Money goes to die. So I'll point this out. I have never felt comfortable with the idea of a movie being a make-out movie. The only time that I have ever made out during a movie is either that the movie was awful and I decided to stop watching the movie, which doesn't really count, and I've only ever done that in private anyway. And the idea that, there was a time where, of course, you'd put on a movie because there were other people around and you didn't want them to hear you, so you put on something to make noise. And honestly, that's also kind of gross, because sometimes it's something that you genuinely like, some music or some movie or some television show, and then you're like, oh, this is what was playing when I was just essentially trying to make sure that somebody didn't overhear my teenage fumblings. So, yeah, make-out movies, not my thing. Reality, the money that Bezos owns effectively no longer exists in the world. It has been destroyed because he won't and cannot spend it all. Yep. There are make-out movies, they call them pornography. So, Real Brick Wall, one of the things that I've always kind of been curious about is the Hump Film Festival, which is a film festival that's run by Dan Savage of Savage Love, where it's like all amateur stuff that people send in, and they have different categories, and it's more about the celebration of sex and the celebration of art and pornography. And I've always been kind of tempted, and yet at the same time I've never actually visited one of those festivals, and it's even online now and I still haven't. But I guess that's partly because I don't have anybody to watch it with, and I don't really would want to watch things on my own. I don't like to watch most things on my own. I tend to want to watch things with other people because then I can talk about it afterwards with them. I can hear their opinions. I can understand how it's affected them, that kind of thing. The Hump Film Festival, Cheeky C. Yeah, we sit on hot rooms naked with strangers and people hump in bushes in the summer. Porn is more of a Saturday morning cartoon. Well, that's true. I do live in the continent where sex is seen in far more of a puritanical sense. So there's been that was a hot take that took longer than I expected it would, but there you go. You know, hot takes, they exist. Let's see here. Anybody who quotes Jonathan Colton in the chat is somebody who deserves to be there. I saw Jonathan Colton in concert when he came here to Montreal with Paul and Storm many years ago. I don't do a whole lot of concerts. It's not that I don't like music. It's just concerts have never really been my thing. But that was a concert that was absolutely worth seeing. It was wonderful. And introduced me to Paul and Storm, who I also like. So there you go. The only disadvantage, though, is that the 1st of May is my parents' anniversary. So, anyway. It wouldn't be if I didn't ask, do you have a hot take on hot takes? I think that hot takes have to be seen as what they are. Entertainment. A hot take is, above all else, kind of entertainment, because if you're positioning yourself as a hot take, then that's what you're doing. And you're ranting. I'm not even ranting that well here. I'm not going off on any explosive hot takes at the moment because we've been talking about more serious subjects. But a hot take is supposed to be entertainment first. It is not information first. And I think that's okay. I think that's just fine, honestly. Here is a hot take that I will throw out there. If you're here, then I assume that means that you've watched at least one of the role-playing streams that we've put out. We put our work into it, but we are doing this as a hobby. We're streaming essentially for ourselves. I mean, we absolutely want to entertain you, and I mean, we're all also entertainers at heart, so we enjoy entertaining and experiencing that as it is. But at the same time, you're both entertaining and insightful. Paladins and clerics would be the same class in D&D, and you can't convince me otherwise. Paladins, I think, are a dumb class. Straight up. Or specifically, I think that the idea that paladins and clerics are separate is dumb. They are both holy warriors. It's just one of them has a little more warrior and one of them is a little more spellcasting. But like, here's the other thing. I don't like the class system in D&D. I think it's way too rigid. And yes, you can customize with things like feats and with subclasses and all that. But like, part of the reason why D&D doesn't appeal to me is that I can't make the character I want. I have to make the character very specifically assigned to me. So there's that. I'm not saying that like if you're playing a paladin you're bad, or that if you're playing a cleric you're bad. I'm just saying that the division between the two is arbitrary. And as I'll point out, in D&D 2nd edition, if you wanted to play a paladin, you had to be lucky enough to roll the major stats that you needed. You had to play a human. You had to be lawful good. I mean, you needed a charisma of 17 for crying out loud. And this was the day of 3d6. Not 4d6, drop the lowest, 3d6. And in fact, if you're doing it by the book, it was 3d6, and you didn't even get to select which stats went where. You rolled for strength, then you rolled for dex, then you rolled for, and then you picked your class afterwards. Hot take 2, D&D 3.5 skill selection was a time-consuming but necessary portion of character customization. Here's my hot take. D&D has never done non-combat stuff well. Straight up. It is disappointing to me because it is a stat check. And it is a stat check which really disappoints me. So things like, for instance, if you have to make a religion roll, it's either do you have skill in religion or not? And if you do, you roll, and then you're comparing a number higher or lower. It's a stat check. There's no way for you to influence that stat check in any reasonable capacity according to the core rules. Now, there are GMs who can find ways to do that or to increase things or give you advantage or whatever, but the reality is stat checks in D&D seem like they're there arbitrarily because they need to be there in order to fit a quota, not because they actually make for compelling gaming. The compelling gaming in D&D has always been through combat, and then it's a very specific kind of combat that you have to enjoy, which is, depending on the edition of D&D that you're playing, essentially wargaming. Non-weapon proficiencies in D&D's 2nd edition were labeled with a great big optional rule across the chapter top. They even changed the color of the heading to make sure that you knew that you didn't have to have it. So, my house rule, explaining why you're trying this / how you're trying this / why you think you can know and it will affect the DC. It's a good house rule. Absolutely. It's essentially stunting. But it's not... The other thing is that it's a binary pass-fail. Yeah, you can kind of assume that like a 20 is a critical hit and then a 1 is a critical fail. But at the same time, it is pass-fail. And to me, that is less interesting because it means that you either are amazing or you are a complete failure and there is nothing in between. To me, D&D is Final Fantasy Tactics, tactical fights with cutscenes in between. Yep, and you know what? Sometimes that's exactly what you want to play. I'm not trying to say that D&D is a bad game. It is one of, if not the most popular role-playing game for a reason. But there's more out there, and D&D has never been designed to handle the stuff between combat very well. So, hot take, it's just branding. Okay, here's a hot take. If you approach me and say that you want to play a rogue, I am immediately suspicious of you. I'm sorry, the crosshair. If you come to me and you say that you want to play a stealthy assassin type, or if you want to play somebody who is a rogue, then immediately I start wondering whether you're actually wanting to play with everybody else or whether you want to be a hot dog player on your own. That makes me suspicious of you. That does not necessarily mean that I don't like rogues. I think that rogues make for very compelling characters. But my first instinct when somebody says that they want to play a rogue is, are you actually going to play with everybody else? Because in my experience, the players who are least likely to want to play with everybody else are the ones who essentially rely on stealth. Hot take. Sometimes I make my players roll just to make it feel like they have the option of failure because my story relies on their success and they don't get to know that. Yes, Aragorn, that's absolutely true. And then sometimes you make them roll even though you know they're going to fail. I mean, if anybody watched the Paranoia stream that we did before, none of the dice rolls mattered ever. I asked them to roll to distract them, and that was it. The only thing that mattered were the tasks that I handed out, and in reality, the story that was taking place was a flimsy opportunity to either provide for comedy or to give an excuse for players to perform strange tasks for my amusement and for the audience's amusement and for their own amusement. That was the whole purpose. It was not, in fact, a great role-playing experience. It was never designed to be. It was designed to be a fun game. And that's what I wanted to accomplish this past Sunday. No, making people roll for no reason diminishes the trust between DM and players. I don't necessarily believe that that's true. I do think, however, that there is a difference between asking somebody to roll and then knowing in your head that it doesn't necessarily matter whether they win or lose, or asking somebody to roll and then disregarding the result. Disregarding the result can be dangerous, but there are ways to interpret results that, in fact, neuter the result that don't diminish DM trust. For instance, if I ask you to roll perception and you fail in your perception roll, and I decide that it doesn't mean that you're going to get ambushed by 900 different, barbarians, then that's okay, and that doesn't diminish trust. But if you roll and you succeed at the roll, and then I decide that since I didn't want you to succeed in the first place, you don't notice the thing that then I'll spring upon you, that can erode trust. So it turns out that what really matters is how you interpret the results, not whether you change the result. Also, hi, Mike the TV. It's always good to see you, obviously. Mike the TV has a special place. When your players don't hit an orc in D&D, let them hit, but make them hit armor or make a cut on the orc, but they take no damage on paper. This falls into the idea that player characters are supposed to be good at what they do. And if you make them roll and they fail, and you say that they failed because they weren't able to execute correctly, then that can feel badly, especially if somebody has a bad string of luck and they roll a lot of failures all at once. Sometimes it's important to make sure that a failure happens because of things outside of a player's control and they were just unlucky. So things like, I was trying to build a house and you roll the crafts roll and then you fail, maybe it's because the wood that you had access to had a hidden rot that you didn't notice and then it collapsed. Sure, it's technically your fault, but it was something that you were probably never going to check anyway, and it was just bad luck for you that the materials that you had didn't work out. But now it's less about the player can't build a house correctly and more about how, in this particular instance, the character was not able to complete the task. Depicting failure as bad luck rather than poor skill is tricky and important. It is tricky because also sometimes you have to fail. So if you as a warrior is somebody like, and I'm not disagreeing with you, Crusher, I think that what you say is correct. But if as a warrior you're like, well, I always hit the target, just sometimes the target doesn't take damage, then that's also sort of saying that like, well, then at that point there's nowhere to go. Your character is already amazing at what they do. And now it's just like, well, it's the weapon's fault and it's never your player. Sometimes characters have to fail. Sometimes the characters have to fail because they made their own damn decisions, or they made their own damn mistakes, or their own damn luck failed them. It's not always because of unavoidable circumstance. With that being said, think about how many times you make somebody actually take a specific role. If we're going in the storyteller system, think about how many times you actually ask somebody to roll dexterity athletics. If you're taking D&D, how many times do you make somebody roll athletics? If you're taking a Genesis system, how many times are you really going to get them to roll athletics in there? And then think about, like, if somebody fails 25% of the time a roll, say, they're still succeeding a lot. But if they're still failing 25% of the time, the point is in that one moment where they fail, if they haven't rolled that roll in a couple of sessions, then to them it sort of feels like, well, then why the fuck did I buy up this shit? Because I failed anyway. And if that happens too often, then the player starts feeling like they are a victim of circumstance and that they lose agency over the game. It isn't true. Remember that we remember our bad rolls more than we remember our good rolls, and we remember our bad streaks of luck more than we remember our good streaks of luck. But at the same time, if that's how a player feels, you don't necessarily want to make that something that they carry with them forever. Aragorn's hot take. Some people think that they want to roleplay, but in reality they're more interested in writing fan fiction, which is fine, but get the fuck out. Yes, this is also included in my never send me a backstory that is longer than a couple of paragraphs. In fact, if you can give it to me point form, I way prefer it. Because truth be told, and I've said this before, and again, this is going to be arrogance coming out, but hey, it's a hot take session. You're probably not that good of a writer if you don't write regularly. I'm not saying that doesn't mean that you don't get to create stories. Role-playing is about a communal storytelling agreement, and people can make amazing stories. But the point is that when you hand me a piece of writing that is 20 pages long, that isn't formatted correctly, that has typos and grammar errors, and that doesn't follow an interesting story structure, and has essentially solved your entire character's backstory, so there's nothing for me to contribute to, I'm disappointed and I'm bored. Because I don't read bad fiction by choice. Why would I want to read it from anybody else? And I would expect people to think the same from me. It's tough for me to be like, well, this is a character who I honestly don't have that much experience with to begin with, because I've just created this character and they're new, and now here's a whole lot of prose about them. It sucks. And what the TV has just said, long backstories can become prescriptive about events in a way that I don't want to deal with as a GM. Absolutely. At that point, I would say you need to just write a novel. Enjoy writing a novel with your character in it, and you can have an author avatar character and self-insert and do all the wankery that you need to do, and that can be just fine. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I don't need to be involved. You're often not that good of a writer you can write for a living. Yes, often. So, are you saying that my plop dealer who's only looking for love won't work in Red Dead Redemption server? Yeah, well. If you are writing too much about your character, you are removing the communal aspect of the game itself. In much the same way that you don't want your GM to railroad you, you don't want to railroad the GM by deciding so much about your character that you'll be upset if anything deviates from the norm. And that GM isn't going to want to run things for your character in that way because they'll feel like they're being handcuffed. Stop doing it. Backstories, the prophetic overtones, major story wrecker. Prophetic overtones are great if you organize them with your GM in advance. You can also absolutely throw backstories in. It's not that backstories are bad, but I would also say that you're going to throw out a lot of it anyway. put some stuff in there to make things interesting. Put some hooks in there so that the GM has a way to draw you into the game and a way for them to draw themselves into your character. But be flexible, because you don't know how the game's going to start or continue. The number of times that I've had people regret things in their backstories is huge. And it's because they just decided to put too much, and because they then refuse to retcon things afterwards. There's a reason that I let my players retcon anything they like in the first few sessions, because you don't necessarily know what character you were wanting to play anyway. I'm totally going to give backstory on my character to Jon with just one line. My character will die due to a banana. See, I think that's great. That's amazing. I love that. My character will die due to a banana? Yep, I can work with that, because that's vague enough that I now have agency to be able to affect it. If it isn't vague, if you say my character is going to die directly after confronting their mother over a certain thing in this particular location, now I no longer have agency. No one expects the banana. Oh, Mike, now I just want to play Soraka. The next game I run is going to have an additional caveat for character creation. In addition to your character must want to be a hero, you must want your character to be a hero. Your adventurer's call to action may not be the death of another person. Aragorn, I support you in this. And part of the reason I support you in this is because it's way too easy to have death be the inciting action. Fridging somebody even before they exist. Also, you know what? Try not being an orphan. Try to have family ties. It's kind of interesting to be able to link your character back to people who care about them. Okay, obviously I'm not saying like if you're an orphan then you're a bad character. Clearly not. But if your character is a lone wolf and has nothing to tie them down, then they're a lot more difficult to relate to. Kaiser Omnic. Hot take. As a player, I don't write pages of background, but I expect my DMs not to write novels either. For players and DMs alike, if you want to write a novel, I'll read it later, not as I play an RPG. I don't even know if I want to read your novel anyway. Remember that also personal creation is very personal. And if you're not writing for an audience but writing for yourself, it will not necessarily be as interesting for anybody else. This is part of the reason why when you tell other people what happened in your role-playing games, often it's boring as fuck and I don't care. Now, as an example, Kung Fu Fenris often writes stuff about the games that he's running, but he keeps it really fucking short and is just enough of like, yeah, they encountered this and they had a great time. Because that's what I care about. Did the players enjoy it? Fine. That's awesome. And I can read one sentence and be like, cool. I can read 3 sentences and be cool. But I don't want to listen for 10 minutes about the role-playing game that you ran. For the most part, I wouldn't even want to hear about my own games that way. The difference is that if you've experienced it with other people, if you have been a part of that story as it was being created, you're more likely to be engaged with it. Hearing the synopsis after the fact, less so. This is also part of the reason why I understand that people don't necessarily want to watch role-playing streams, or they must catch up using the VODs, that they aren't just going to read the synopses and come in, because they want to be part of that creation. The reality is that when we stream games, the thing that I've always stated, and that I will continue to state, is that I think that the true stars of the streams that we put on RPG Clinic are the players. It is not the characters, and it is not the story inside the game. I want you to be invested in the players and their excitement about the story and their excitement about the game. I can definitely want you to be excited about the story and the characters in the game anyway. That's totally cool. But the point is that you have these people in front of you who are playing, and I want everybody to feel like they are sitting at the table as opposed to listening to a story after the fact. Listening to a story after the fact, unless that story has been crafted very specifically for mass consumption, it's not going to be fun and it will not be interesting for you. That's the difference. And so backstory is something that you've written for yourself, not for other people, most of the time. If you are a trained novelist or writer or screenwriter or designer of narratives or whatever, then maybe you are writing a backstory that is designed to appeal to other people. But for the most part, when people are role-playing, they're writing for themselves, which is a lot less interesting. There are certain mechanics in 7th Rulebook that I do actually enjoy. That's fine. Kung Fu Fenris, the 20 questions, that's one of the things that Legend of the Five Rings does incredibly well. I think that's a really great way of creating a character. But being an orphan makes my character tragic. If anybody disagrees with Zen Robo about that, then feel free to do so. You're a fucking idiot if you do. She knows better than most. do not want to read my Pendragon recaps. Fair. Side note, you were saying about we were doing these TTRPGs as a hobby and it got left unfinished due to D&D hot takes. My brain can't cope with the hot take that was coming. I'll get back to it, Crosshair, I promise. RPG art happens in the space the players inhabit? Absolutely. Based on past RPGs I've played, the storyteller GM wants to have at least 1 page of background, so I get used to writing up that length of backstory. 1 page is fine if it's for a role-playing game that you're playing with somebody else. I personally don't ask that anybody writes anything. I ask that you have a conversation with me. Because I also deal better with somebody in an interactive format as opposed to a passive format. We're really invested in Jot. Duh. In my Saturday game, I'm playing 2 orphans back to back. Well, one was stolen by Faye, and because of timey-wimey, probably her birth parents are dead. Her adoptive parents outlived her. The second orphan was an orphan because I wanted her to have a cool last name once we'd established Faye naming conventions. Those are better reasons than I want to be an orphan because I just don't want to have to deal with having a family. Yeah, foreign games often require a lot of writing, and it's essentially it's an effort sink. When I was running games at Immortal Vigilance, there was a requirement that anytime you spent XP, you had to write a paragraph or 2 about justifying why that XP was worthwhile. And it was essentially their way of sort of saying, players, this is our like slight way of trying to prevent you from just completely min-maxing. And to me, I'm like, all you're doing is saying, I don't trust you as players, and I'm going to make everybody do a lot of extra work. They don't want to write it. I don't want to read it. It was dumb. I tried to eliminate the system. They wouldn't let me. I tried to reset the campaign because there were too many people who were just way too high rank. They wouldn't let me, so I quit. Because I wasn't having fun at that point. Backstory needs to only be coherent to the world it takes place in, as long as it isn't ruining the DM or player agency. Yeah. So remember, this is something that I'm actually kind of glad because it crystallized that thought in my head. If you write your backstory that's too restrictive, you are railroading the GM. And if you expect that your GM doesn't railroad you, you have to expect not to railroad the GM. Had a character that is actually working against her family, and we'll get into detail about it. See, that's fine. OMG, GV, I feel like you're speaking to my text RP admin soul. Yes, like, I'm sorry, but when you force me to read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of words so that I can approve people's XP expenditures, I will fucking quit. I hate it. If I made my players have to justify every fucking piece of XP that they spent by literally spending half an hour to write shit down, and then I have to read 50 different players or 100 different players 500 words each, I am going to go bonkers. It sucks. It really sucks. We have to stop doing this because it literally is telling players, I do not trust you, so do busy work. And GMs, because you don't trust players, you have to do busy work yourself. It is the worst. And online role-playing is worse for it because they are not generating useful content. You are writing for yourself, not for other people. And if you are writing for yourself, that's cool, but that's called a journal or a diary, and you should do it in there. And you shouldn't force me to deal with it just so that we can continue to roleplay. I trust that you're not min-maxing, and if you are min-maxing, I'll recognize it and I'll fucking tell you. Fuck! The very last session of my Star Wars Edge of the Empire game is on Sunday, and I'm excited. I'm going to put a retrospective on the system in the Discord. See, that I would really be interested in reading, Real Brick Wall, because that is about the game and not about the story. The story specifically is something that is personal to you, and small details are fine, but I definitely don't want to read, 10, 20, 50 pages about your game if I know that I'm never going to be able to experience it in a way that will make it worthwhile for me. Here's a hot take. I don't really watch other people roleplay. Not a lot. And if I do, it's because I'm interested in the players and not the story. Like, I love watching the Red Dead Redemption roleplay that's happening, but it's because I really enjoy the player reactions, and I enjoy the asides that I get, and I enjoy seeing the player interact with the game. I'm less interested in the story because, honestly, I can watch TV and then it's a perfectly scripted sequence. Now, that's me, and it seems a little weird coming from me because I roleplay online. But as I've said before, and this is getting back to the Crosshair saying this, the reason we roleplay online is because we are entertainers and like to entertain, but above all, we wanted to play a game with ourselves, with our Like as a group, we wanted to play games, and we were like, this is a way for us to change the way that we play a game. And we found people who enjoyed watching and enjoyed watching with us, and that's fantastic and wonderful. It is something that I am indebted to, because I probably wouldn't have a partner if I didn't have that. Well, okay, I'm not necessarily going to say that, but it definitely helped. And I've found a community that I adore, and I've met people who I consider friends, and I know that there is a parasocial relationship going on which happens whenever you have any kind of like Twitch streaming. That's a parasocial relationship. Look it up. But it is amazing. And at the same time, if we're not having fun in terms of just the game that we're playing, we'll stop. We don't actually owe you anything, and you don't owe us anything. We love your support, and your support keeps us going, and that's amazing. But I will point out to anybody who's looking to get into the streaming gig, a donation doesn't put any requirement on you unless you put that requirement on yourself. So it is, if I didn't know the players changing, would have been a fucking drag. See, absolutely, the Crosshair, I completely agree with you. I don't think that Changeling is necessarily this amazing story that then we can like adapt for the screen and then put it on there without like a shit ton of reworking and stuff like that. What's important is that you actually give a fuck about the fact that, you know, Scott's trying. Scott's portrayal of Braum is amazing. The way that Kate makes unexpected decisions that are still somehow totally in character thrills me. When Liz manages to like create an arc that I can see coming, but then the way that it evolves her character, that's amazing to me. That's what's fun. That's what fascinates me. And that's what I'd want to watch. I mean, when I'm playing in a game, I enjoy the game and I enjoy the story and I enjoy crafting the story. And if people get into that story, that's fantastic. If people get into the characters, that's wonderful. I love when people react well to a PC. I especially love it when they react to an NPC, because that's me. And that's awesome. But the reality is that I don't think that's the most interesting part of a stream. Hot takes. This was a hot take episode, so I'm trying to lean into it. I just hope that nobody comes away from it regretting tuning in or listening to what I have to say. A habit I've gotten into with backstories to write down a few bullet points to talk to the storyteller or DM about. Then for my own fun and stretch my literary wings, I'll write up 1 or 2 paragraph long short stories about some key points. So Requiem Lost, what you're doing then is you're saying, I want to have a dialogue with the storyteller about what my backstory is, and then I'm doing it for myself, is writing this down. And that's important. It's when you write something and hand it to a GM and expect them to read it and memorize it, then I have a problem. Because I also have run games where someone's like, but I put something in my backstory. And I'm like, but your backstory was 4,000 words long and I didn't care to read all of it because it was awful. And I'm not going to remember something if I'm bored. So yeah, expecting that I'll remember your backstory is bad. Writing a backstory because you want to explore your own wings, fantastic. That's great. Basically, tabletop role-playing games are a unique medium and don't have the same features as many other fiction media. Completely. I mean, can you imagine what would happen if you were watching, let's say, I don't know. Okay, here's an example. It's relatively simple. Let's say that you're watching Game of Thrones. And I'm going to ignore, like, we're going to ignore the whole, like, did the showrunners fuck the show up or not? I don't care. First season of Game of Thrones, which everybody loved. Can you imagine what would have happened if it came right up to the point when they're like, okay, so spoilers for season 1 of Game of Thrones coming up right now. So mute, I will raise my hands when I'm done. But if they say, okay, so here's Ned Stark. Is he going to be executed or not? Roll a die to find out. Then that's not compelling storytelling. There, done. Game of Thrones spoilers are over. In much the same way that I can't stand it when somebody writes a story and then when you ask, hey, what did you intend by this? And they were like, I don't know. It's up to the reader to interpret. And I'm like, well, do you know what actually happened? And they're like, no, I don't. Then I'm like, well, then you didn't fucking tell a story. You're role-playing now, and role-playing in this particular context is not correct. You actually need to know what happened. I think that you need to know what happened. You can change your mind about what happened potentially if you've crafted it in a certain way, But if you've just decided that you don't care about the ending, or that you don't care about the motivation, or that you don't care about the actual determination of what's happened in your piece of fiction, then what you have done, in essence, is said, I can't trust my own storytelling, so I'm going to deliberately make it vague so that it's up to everybody else to interpret instead. And I think that that just means that you need to have more confidence in yourself. Hot take. Oh, here we go. Hot take. If you play a tabletop game and you have a character's secret or actions that only occurs between you and the DM or another player, and no other player knows about it, it's dumb and unimportant. PC secrets are only cool if they get discovered in time and for there to be an impact. You are 150% correct about this. Because here's the thing. You can have a secret motivation for yourself that explains why your character acts in a certain way, and that's great. But the only person who will ever get to experience that joy is you, if you don't reveal it to other people. If your secret is something that you will never reveal at any cost, then that is just for you. And in a way, that's being selfish, because then you don't get to find out. The other thing is, I won't necessarily believe you. If at the end of a campaign you were like, the reason why I was kind of a dick to this character this whole time is because secretly I had a crush on him, but that never came out to anybody ever, and there was never enough hints for it, and there was never a way for anybody to discover that crush ever, then it may not as well not have existed. And what you are in fact doing is retroactively changing the game just because you feel like it's something to make you feel clever. Don't do it. If you have a secret, it's okay if you want to keep a secret from players for a little while, but plan to have that secret come out. And just try, not having a secret from other players. Your characters can keep secrets from each other, but try just being like, yeah, this is a thing. My character has a crush on your character, and I'm not going to tell anybody about it in-game, but it's happening there. And that can be an interesting way for people to interact with the story. In much the same way that sometimes in a movie you see things only from the protagonist's perspective, and sometimes you see things from the protagonist and the antagonist's perspective. There's ways to make secrets interesting, folks, but secrets are only interesting if they're known. Fuck. Patch secretly was fond of basically everyone she will never tell. See, like, that I knew. That's not a secret. That's not a player's secret. Good erotica costs money, and even that's a gamble. Yep, absolutely. And you know what? If you write erotica for a reason, that's cool. That is completely cool. There's nothing wrong with producing... There's nothing wrong with sex work as long as it's between consenting people. Do whatever you want. That's great. Can we be honest, like, no postmodernism allowed? I mean, look, the point is that it's... Yeah, anyway. I can't imagine how someone would read a Vampire the Masquerade book and get the impression that fetish feel and erotica was appropriate for the game /S. Vampire the Masquerade is a game that is incredibly troubled. It is still troubled, even after its 5th edition, and it is starting to slip from the social consciousness because it actually gets a lot of things wrong. It is a game that I am finding myself more and more uncomfortable interacting with. When Bloodlines 2 was announced, at first I was like, this is going to make a lot of people happy. And then the trailer came out and I was like, this makes me feel awful. And not in a way that I'm like, I get to play the bad guy, but just like, this is glorifying things that are kind of gross. So yeah, Vampire is a lot to answer for. That's why Werewolf 5th edition is something that I'm watching very carefully, because if it doesn't nail that landing, and it will be tough, if it doesn't nail that landing, Werewolf will finally be revealed as a game that is deeply problematic. There we go. Someday, at least in a one-shot, we need some PC on PC romance. So, possibly, Kate, there's nothing wrong with PC on PC romance if it's done correctly. The reason why I'm very hesitant to let players start a game planning on a PC romance is that then the game sometimes turns insular and it becomes about those two characters and that's it. It also means that if one player decides they no longer want to be part of the romance, but the other one does, then it creates a breakup atmosphere in the game. And for some player groups, that's awful and difficult to handle because it starts feeling like an actual breakup to yourself as well. A storyteller is, by their very nature, trying to play the game for the players, so they can kind of make it a bit easier because they don't necessarily have to have the same sort of reactions. I'm not saying the PC on PC romance is bad. I think that it can work out very well. But I think it's very difficult, and I strongly encourage players not to try to make it happen. If it happens, great, but it's not something that should be forced. In much the same way, when you're doing any kind of improv, if you have something in mind and you're like, I want to steer things in this direction because it's what I want to do, and everyone else is going in another direction, but you wrench them in that direction because you're like, but I planned for this, that's bad. You're fucking up everyone else's improv. And that's what often happens in PC romance, that you're like, well, I want to have I just want to have a great romance with this other player. And like, that's difficult to plan for. None of the romances that have happened in the games that you've seen, either in Exaltwitch or in Changeling, I've been specifically like, I'm creating a boyfriend or a girlfriend for this character. Instead, I create a character. Sometimes that character is definitely flirtatious. Sometimes that character is definitely interested in that person, but I never create a character thinking this will be the partner. It's always, this is a character, and maybe they'll get picked up and maybe they won't. I don't force things. It's not useful or good to force things when it comes to romance and that kind of stuff. So, let me see other things. Crosshair says, I'm also going to do a total hot take. You can do whatever the fuck you want as long as you're not harming somebody else. If you want to sit in your underwear and drink 24/7 in a hut in the Andes, more power to you. Possibly, but the point is that you may not know if your actions are harming somebody else. If, for instance, I was worried about your physical well-being, and then you were like, but it makes me happy to constantly hit myself with a hammer, then you can say, I'm not hurting anybody else, but in reality, you might be. And then it becomes a question of how much do you have to care about how I feel? But in reality, consent is what's most important, so yes. Vampire the Masquerade is the inherent flaw of playing characters that have to do rape analog in order to live, and you go from there. Yes, absolutely. Also, Vampire the Masquerade is a game that introduces a mechanic, humanity, that's designed to be its way of saying, oh, but we're actually saying that being a vampire is bad, except the game isn't really designed for you to take advantage of humanity all that much. I have never seen a vampire game where humanity is played into it as a legitimate, like, focal point of the game, which is what the game is trying to tell you to do, but it isn't. It's just not. Humanity is essentially there to make sure that players don't go on like massive murder sprees, because then mechanically they'll have a disadvantage. So, Dracula was really morally skewy when it was revealed. Published? Yep, absolutely. Undies in the Andes will totally be my book. Absolutely. Totally love that. Hence the one-shots, you can wedge stuff in there. So that's one of the advantages of one-shots. If you're like, yep, I want to be in a relationship with this other player, and we know that it's only going to last for 3 hours, then that's something that you can kind of be like, sure. One-shots are great for experimentation because they aren't permanent. By definition, they aren't something that is going to last for very long. That's one of the advantages. Make every NPC romanceable and just roll with it. That's my motto. I mean, that's what they basically do in like Mass Effect these days. It's not a bad idea. Hot take, Vampire and some of the World of Darkness per extension is an RPG version of BDSM. A lot of people are doing it wrong, and there needs to be a lot more focus of keeping in touch with not destroying people's feelings. Yup. Absolutely. There are times where we want to feel like horrible people, or we want to have horrible things happen to us in a safe, controlled environment, because that's either, in terms of BDSM, potentially something that gets your rocks off, or maybe it gets your literary mind going, or maybe it just like helps you in your daily life, or maybe you just think it's fun. All of those things are fine, but you have to acknowledge that what you're doing is essentially BDSM. I ran a Golconda game for a while. I was humanity focused. So yes, I can see that. But Golconda is a very different, it's the opposite spectrum of what the game is trying to say, which is that like succumbing to the beast is inevitable. But like, have you ever actually played a game where somebody has succumbed to the beast and it's not because the player was essentially trying to do that? It's, yes, I know that it's probably happened, but it's incredibly fucking rare. In Exalted, I generally tell my players to avoid using their lunar bond to make a connection to another player. If they do make it relatively weak, it can make the game a bit uncomfortable at times, I find. Absolutely, Requiem, and we had that in Exalted for Exaltwitch. There was a lunar bond, and it was ignored for the longest time. And that was completely fine. And there was some play around somebody being like, I'm drawn to this person, and yet I also am drawn to this other person. And I know that one of my draws was because of a lunar bond, and she was able to resist it. And it was something for the PCs to interact with. It was, you're my lunar mate now, yeah. So it is something, it is a difficult thing. But the other thing is that honestly, if that's the sort of thing that you don't feel like you can play properly, or if it's something that you feel like your players aren't going to react well to it or whatever, you don't have to use it. There's a lot of things you don't have to do in role-playing games. Besides, 3rd edition also really changes the lunar bond in a lot of ways, especially if you look at the Lunar's core book. So mostly ran 2nd edition. Well, 2nd edition lunar bonds were a thing. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Completely and utterly. The 2nd edition kind of added some difficult stuff in there. But like, look, if you looked up fucking Zizek in any of the older White Wolf books for Werewolf, she was essentially like a weird, oversexed, evil badass, and that wasn't fair. So, you know, whatever. Puts finish in top order just in case. Hot take: my favorite werewolf games are effectively grittier versions of Little House on the Prairie. Pack equals family versus the world. So Aragorn, that's why you like Werewolf the Forsaken as opposed to Werewolf the Apocalypse, would be my guess. And that's fine if that's the kind of game that you want to play. Totally. I find that I don't like Forsaken as much as Apocalypse, but I also recognize that I've played Apocalypse a lot. And I also Apocalypse have shifted and morphed as I've played it to become a game that I'm much more comfortable with, because I just ignore the things I don't like. So that's part of it. My understanding is, in essence, the lunar bond is just a connection of some kind, not explicitly coded as a true love bond. Fair. Okay, that's not something I have to worry about too much. One thing I've totally learned from the TTRPG streams, you can just say if things aren't good. From the lesson of you can talk is a big one. Yes, and it is still it's an issue for a lot of people. It's still an issue for us. I am of British ancestry, and one of the things that the British stereotype says is that you have a stiff upper lip, and you just, you keep calm and you carry on, and you do things, and you just weather the problems without complaint. And honestly, that's bullshit. Now, I'm not saying that I want to complain all the time, or that I want everybody to know everything that goes wrong in my life at all times. But if I don't talk about the things that bother me, then I can't reasonably expect that other people can help me with them. So it's something that I have to struggle with. And there are definitely times where I'm like, I'm suffering and I'm not going to let other people know because that's more noble. And that's stupid in a lot of ways. So anyway. You can both in APOC, I think. Hopefully in W5 they'll take that. So I do agree with that, Kung Fu Fenders. There's no reason why you have to play in a werewolf game and kind of make Sept life or Cairn life a huge part of it. You can totally be like, look, we're a pack in a very small area, and this is what we do. And you don't have to necessarily involve the meta plot that much. That's kind of why I feel like there was an issue between Apocalypse and Forsaken, is that Forsaken basically said the meta no longer exists. And Apocalypse is like, well, yes, there is a meta, but you don't have to use it if you don't want to. And I feel like a lot of the New World of Darkness or the Chronicles of Darkness essentially said, well, the idea that there is an expanded world around you is something that we are discarding, and I didn't like that as much. Admittedly, again, I grew up with the classic World of Darkness, and that was the kind of story that I really wanted to play. So there's that. The small sept in Manitoba. Yep. Honestly, upper class Brits are positively super sharing of emotions compared to Finnish men. Probably. I'm glad you wandered in now and not when you would have gotten spoilers, potentially. I mean, potentially. You didn't see how I said that I really enjoy watching people you roleplay because I'm interested in you as opposed to your character. But, there's that. Spoilers for games you play in. It's true. That is true. Does anybody else have any major hot takes that they want to throw down here? Here's a See, because I have a whole bunch of like mediocre takes, and I don't know if I want to bring them up because they're mediocre, and therefore like they don't really apply for a only hot takes episode of RPG Clinic. Or are we all hot taked out for now? A lukewarm take? Yeah, like I have lukewarm takes, but I said that it was only going to be hot takes this episode, so. All right. Well, then in that case, let me let you know what's happening. Tomorrow there is going to be Punchy. That's at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. That's over on Elizabeth A. Neal's channel. On Saturday, I imagine that we're going to see something from Scott. I have a guess that it might involve Surgeon Simulator 2, but it might not. It sort of depends on who shows up. Sunday is going to be Good Society, a Jane Austen RPG that's run by Elizabeth. It will feature me, Scott, and Kate, but also our guest star Jess Fildes, who's coming in to participate as well. And that's going to be the last of the one-shots before we begin our first season. Our session 0 for Star Wars Reach, our Edge of the Empire campaign, is going to happen not this Sunday, but the following Sunday. So that's something that you should absolutely check out, and that's going to be right here on RPG Clinic. John. I think we have to create some and also have to work on a big spreadsheet so Kate actually has time to work on stuff. Yep. So what is it, Aragorn? What? I'm also going to point out that tomorrow, any chance that I'm playing the Dowager, I will not reveal any of this information at this time. I will also point out to folks that tomorrow I may do some streaming on my personal channel. That's twitch.tv/Jon Verrall, because the new, the remake of Tony Hawk Pro Skater 1 and 2 is going to be out, and I just might fuck around on skateboards for a while talking with people. So that might be something that I'll do during the day because I'm not working tomorrow. I have the day off, and that will be fun. So that's all that I have for you right now. Thanks so much for tuning in for Hot Takes. I appreciate seeing all of you here. I appreciate all of your hot takes. I hope that people realize that in the nature of hot takes, there are some exaggerations that may occur. That's the way it is. I'm going to give a special shout out to anybody here who has ever had a hot take about a role-playing game, because that is an awesome thing for you to do. We'll see if we do. I imagine that there may be more only hot take episodes that happen, but this is what I had for today, and I think that worked out. Thanks again to awesome mods, Crosshair and Aragorn, who are super awesome always. And I look smoldering. I mean, I am going to smolder, I assume. But I'm going to go eat some dinner because I think that is the hottest take of all. I'll catch you later. Oh, and look out. Soon we're going to have some interesting stuff to show you.